Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, 3 Decades of HIV Detection, presented by Professor Marc van Ranst. I am Soon Pham of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. LabRoots is the leading scientific social networking site, and we're proud to bring you this interactive web seminar. For more information, please visit us at labroots.com. Here's how the presentation will work. We want to hear from you. Questions, comments, and even answers can be submitted via the green Q&A button at the lower left of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone, but if not, we'll make sure to follow up with you by email. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. If you cannot hear or see this presentation properly, let us know by clicking on the support button at the top right or the Q&A button in the lower left. Today's webinar is sponsored by Abbott. Abbott is committed to helping live the best possible life through the power of health. For more than 125 years, Abbott has brought new products and technologies to the world in nutrition, diagnostics, medical devices, and branded generic pharmaceuticals that create more possibilities for more people at all stages of life. Abbott is a global leader in in vitro diagnostic, offering a broad portfolio spanning immunoassay, clinical chemistry, hematology, blood screening, molecular identification, point of care, and informatics. For more information, please visit abbott.com. I would like to now introduce today's speaker, Professor Marc van Ranst. Professor van Ranst graduated as a medical doctor from the University of Leuven in 1990. He then worked at the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York and received his PhD degree in virology in 1994. Since 1999, he is a professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Currently, he is Associate Chief of the Department of Laboratory Medicine and heads the Clinical Virology Laboratory at the University Hospital Leuven in Belgium. He has published over 270 scientific papers in peer-reviewed and Medline Index journals and contributed chapters to 6 books on viral molecular evolution and bioinformatics. Professor van Ranst teaches virology, epidemiology, and bioinformatics at the University of Leuven in Belgium. I will now turn it over to Professor van Ranst for his presentation.
Thank you very much. And today we'll talk about 3 decades of HIV detection. We know that HIV has been around much longer, but it has been already 30 years that we are able to detect HIV. This is my disclosure, so this is an Abbott-sponsored talk. And let's start with going through time, and if we do so, we have to start around 1900, around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Many European countries, and also Belgium, had colonies in Africa. And Congo was at that time almost the personal property of the Belgian king Leopold II. At that moment, the beginning automotive industry needed a lot of rubber to make tires, and Leopold II he used actually forced labor to extract rubber from the forest, the equatorial forest. In fact, he was, and in Belgium we don't recognize that enough, he was an extremely brutal dictator, killed about 10 million humans, mutilated many millions more if the production quota of rubber were not met. Due to demand for rubber and always more and more rubber, or to escape the atrocities in Congo, hundreds of thousands of people fled into an often unfamiliar jungle where they encountered chimpanzees, which they normally would not really meet all that often. And that's the common chimpanzee, which you see here, that's the Pan troglodytes, and the pygmy chimpanzee, the Pan paniscus. And they live in the area in red in the north of Congo and the neighboring countries to the north of it. Now, we have to realize that human and chimpanzees share 96, some say 98% of their DNA. So they're extremely genetically related, and that also means that we share the possibility to be infected by similar infectious organisms. And this is what really happened. This is how the simian immunodeficiency virus jumped species to humans. Now, how did this happen? I mean, sexually transmitted diseases between chimpanzees and humans, that's not going to happen. I mean, that's near impossible. However, they eat bushmeat, and bushmeat killing of great apes such as chimpanzees, together with deforestation, are in fact the greatest threat to survival of these chimps. So people are eating chimps. And now when these chimps are well cooked, that's not necessarily a problem. However, when the meat is not thoroughly cooked, then the viruses in the chimp species can jump to humans. And this in fact has happened a number of times. Here you see in this phylogenetic tree depicting the phylogenetic relationships of HIV. You can see that HIV M and N on separate occasions jumped from chimpanzees to humans, probably around 1900 or so. This was from chimpanzees. HIV-1 subtype O did not originate from chimpanzees, that originated from gorillas. So eating bushmeat, eating chimpanzees, led to the zoonotic transmission of a simian immunodeficiency virus to humans. And that was really the beginning of HIV. This was then carried by people who got infected, traveling along the streams, the rivers, the Congo stream, to Leopoldville, to what is now known as Kinshasa, where it is thought, based on phylogenetic analysis, that the epidemic reached the big city there already in the 1920s, completely unrecognized, but it started spreading from there. And then really in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the infection made its way to Europe, to the Caribbean, from there to the US, to Australia, and ultimately the rest of the world. And they're now, now the virus is present in all places on the planet. And then really the HIV story starts in 1981. 1981 was the year that the first IBM personal computer was launched. Also, the Space Shuttle Columbia was launched in 1981. Ronald Reagan took office on January 10, 1981, was shot on March 30th, and this was also the year when Pope John Paul II there was an assassination attempt on the 13th of May. This was also the year that two doctors at San Francisco General Hospital, Dr. Cohn and Dr. Wolberding, suddenly saw patients with an extremely rare disease, Kaposi sarcoma, which is a disease which they normally would not see. It's a disease which is in fact caused by human herpes virus type 8. It's an opportunistic infection which they saw in homosexual men, and this disease was until that time so rare that when they saw even a couple of cases, they knew that something new and something rare was going on. This was also the year of 1981 when in UCLA, in Los Angeles, Michael Gottlieb saw also patients with another rare disease, with pneumocystis carinii, which is a yeast-like fungus. And he saw a couple of these patients in his practice, and in the practice of a colleague of him, Joel Weissman, gay physician with a largely gay practice. They also saw this pneumocystis fungus in these patients, and immediately they knew that this was something which seemed to be present, and maybe in even growing numbers in the gay population. The first description in the literature of what we now know as HIV was in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which is an obscure journal, only read by epidemiologists, I guess, which describes weird outbreaks in different parts of the world. Although it is really focused on the United States, definitely at that period. So in June 1981, they described the pneumocystis pneumonia epidemic in Los Angeles, and that was really the beginning of the realization that there was a deadly epidemic first in people who were gay. The CDC in July 1981 tried to reassure the population by saying that, and I quote here, "There is no apparent danger from contagion to non-homosexuals. the best evidence against contagion is that no cases have been reported to date outside the homosexual community or in women. So in the beginning they thought, well, this is a disease which is only in homosexuals. And in the beginning the CDC was not overly worried about this disease. The first name of this disease was politically extremely incorrect, and in fact it was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, a term which was quickly forgotten, but that pointed really to the fact that in the beginning they thought that this was only a disease in gays. Then comes 1982. That was the year when Erno Rubik had his Rubik's Cube launched, the year of the first CD player, the year of the Falkland War, and the movie which was extremely popular in 1982 was E.T. And that was also the year that we realized that that HIV was transmitted using intravenous drug use. So it was not only in the gay community, also intravenous drug users would have it. And this was also the year that we had the first idea that HIV might also be transmitted through blood transfusions. And people who received blood transfusions in that period, for example in the United States, had about a 1% chance of contracting HIV, and especially hemophiliacs who need factor VIII from many, many donors became infected with HIV. Well, not only with HIV, also with very often hepatitis C. So this led to an extremely weird situation where at that time they knew that there was something in the blood supply, but at that time they could not test for it. So they knew that the disease existed, but they had no assays for it yet. 1982 was also the year when the Centers for Disease Control coined the name AIDS for the first time. In fact, that was on July 27, 1982. The acquired immune deficiency syndrome was now replacing GRID as the official name for this disease. Mind you that by the end of 1982, President Reagan had not mentioned the word AIDS in public yet. It was at that time not on the political agenda at all. 1983 was the year when the first version of Microsoft Word was on our computers. This was the year when George Remy Hergé, who is the cartoonist who brought us Tintin, died. This was the year when Lech Walesa received the Nobel Prize. The Polish Union leader received the Nobel Prize, Peace Nobel Prize. And this was also the year when Sally Ride became the first American woman in space on the Challenger mission. This was also the year when the virus was first discovered, the AIDS virus. And this was by Luc Montagnier, French virologist, who isolated what they knew was a T-lymphotropic retrovirus from people with AIDS. And they called it the lymphadenopathy-associated virus, or LAV. Luc Montagnier received the Nobel Prize in medicine in 2008, together with Harold Surhausen for his work on human papillomaviruses. So he received the Nobel Prize for it. This is Luc Montagnier in his younger days, showing for the first time in 1983 electron micrographs of HIV particles budding from the surface of an infected cell. This was also the year that we learned that HIV was an enveloped virus, so we got to know something about the structure of the viral particle. This was also the year when the first electron micrographs were made, where you can see here in red the HIV particles budding from an infected T helper cell. In 1983, it was also discovered, and this was a big surprise, that HIV was also present in Central Africa and was in fact killing scores of people there. This was realized in 1983. It was published in 1984 in The Lancet by the Belgian Peter Piot, who for the first time had a study that strongly argued that the situation in Central Africa represented a new epidemiological setting for this worldwide disease, that of significant transmission in a large heterosexual population. So since 1983-84, we realized that HIV is not only a homosexual or intravenous drug user disease, but is also thriving in the heterosexual population. And this is really when the AIDS hysteria started. Suddenly, everybody was becoming afraid of HIV. The wild 60s ended in 1983, and people became really afraid that they would contract HIV. 1984 was the year when the first Apple Macintosh computer was used with the first graphical interface, the first mouse. Was the year when Purple Rain was the popular song by Prince, the year of the famine in Ethiopia leading to almost 1 million deaths, and this was also the boycott of Russia of the Olympic Games in Los Angeles. This was the year when Bob Gallo sort of rediscovered the HIV virus himself, actually almost completely ignoring the work of Luc Montagnier, and he gave it a different name. He had already discovered HTLV1 and 2, so for him it was very logical to call his virus the HTLV3, and that was the name in the literature that many of the Americans used for that. So human T lymphotropic virus type 3, however, we now know that this was probably actually, he sort of rediscovered the same virus from a sample which he received from Luc Montagnier. And although Luc Montagnier disagreed with it, he did not receive or did not have a share in the Nobel Prize that Luc Montagnier received. At this point in time, people became extremely anxious because HIV was a disease where you cannot spot which person carries the AIDS virus. People would look completely healthy and still harbor the virus, and you could get infected through these people. On est tous concernés par le SIDA. We're all confronted with AIDS. Even Superman could get AIDS, and this was the time when the advertisements for the anti-AIDS campaigns really started to be very creative. At that point in time, it was not only important to explain what is HIV, how can you get it, but also how you would not get AIDS from, for example, a bug bite. For some people, it was quite surprising that you could not get HIV or AIDS from a mosquito that would bite you, even if it had bitten a person with HIV a couple of minutes earlier. You wouldn't get AIDS in a restaurant where people would suddenly be afraid that their waiter would, in the kitchen, bleed on their salad, and people would really become a little bit paranoid about getting HIV. And this led to, in fact, great discrimination of AIDS patients, where people would not touch persons who were infected with HIV. People would think that they would get it from using kitchen utensils, from touching doorknobs that were touched by HIV patients, from going to the same toilet, for drinking from the same glass. A lot of awareness was really not there on how to catch HIV and how not. 1985 was the year of We Are the World, part of Life Aid Against the Hunger in Africa. It was the year when Gorbachev introduced Glasnost Perestroika, when the Rainbow Warrior was bombed by the French secret agents because they were protesting nuclear testing. This was also the year when Rock Hudson died from AIDS, and that was a wake-up call. This was the first time when a famous American died of AIDS. And this was also the first time that in September 1985, more than 4 years after Ronald Reagan took office, that he first pronounced the word AIDS in public. And that was not even in a speech, that was in response to a reporter's question. So in fact, he managed for 4 years not to pronounce the word AIDS in public. That changed in 1985, and to his credit, after that he mentioned it quite a lot. But the first couple of years, this was not, especially on the Republican agenda, and it was largely ignored, but that changed after 1985. 1985 was also the year when the nucleotide sequence of the AIDS virus was published. So from then on, we know exactly the genetic composition of the AIDS virus. And luckily, this was also the year when the first HIV antibody test was launched on March 4, 1995, and you see the smiling faces of the Abbott brass launching their first HIV assay. And that was not a small feat. I mean, that was in all the newspapers. It was extremely important that 4 years after knowing that this disease existed, there was now finally a first generation of tests that could detect serologically the people having come in contact with the HIV virus. So that was really a big deal, but it was only the first generation of HIV immunoassays. In fact, what was used as antigens was a fairly crude H9 cell line lysate with HIV that was used as an antigen. Which meant that although the sensitivity was not bad, sensitivity was 99%, the specificity left a lot to be desired. It was only 95 to 98%, and only IgG could be detected. So that was the first generation where that really suffered from many false positives and also from batch-to-batch variation. 2 years later, there was a second generation of HIV immunoassays where they used not crude lysates but recombinant HIV antigens, and that increased the specificity dramatically to over 99%. So now we had a sensitivity of 99.5 and a specificity of over 99%. So since then, the HIV assays are actually quite well. It didn't stop there. A third generation HIV immunoassays where they used an antigen conjugate so that not only IgG but also other immunoglobulins would be detected, increased the specificity to 99.5, and since then HIV assays can be rightfully called the Rolls-Royces in serology. We know very much that many of the serological assays that we use in a virological laboratory are not reaching these numbers, but HIV assays, luckily, they do. And then finally, a little bit later, in 1997, there was the fourth generation HIV immunoassays that combine antibody and antigen detection, so that sensitivity even increased to 99.8%. And the further we are with the generations of immunoassays, the smaller the window period really became for these assays. And that had a tremendous impact. What you see here is from a paper in Transfusion in 2000, really reflecting the situation in the US, where pre-testing, the risk of, and first look at HIV there, the risk of contracting HIV after a transfusion was about 1 in 100. After 1985, that gradually went down, and mind you, the vertical axis is logarithmically there. It went down, and nowadays, except for maybe the window period, these things are in an extremely small window period. The chance of the risk of transmission after transfusion is in the order of 1 in a million donations and dropping. This was the same for hepatitis C. Better assays meant lower risk of transmission. Because of the extremely high risk of transmission of hepatitis B, and that probably has something to do with the extremely high viral loads that are around, that has never went, or the risk of transmission for hepatitis B never went down as far as we enjoyed for HIV and hepatitis C. But these tests really changed the whole picture of HIV diagnosis. Then we come to 1986. That was the year that the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded after 73 seconds of flight, killing all 7 aboard. That was the year of the smoking ban on public transportation in the US and later on in other countries. It was the year of the Chernobyl disaster and the year when Out of Africa with Meryl Streep and Robert Redford wins the Oscar. That was also the year when the word HIV was chosen by the ICTV, the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses, to, well, the new name, because people were arguing about LAV, about HTLV3. It was the French against the Americans, and this was settled by calling it a third name, and that was the name that that we're using now, human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. And that's a short name which really stuck and was used very, very often. This was also the year that an HIV-2 was diagnosed in AIDS patients in West Africa. This virus also has an origin in monkeys, this time in sooty mangabees. They're the reservoir for HIV-2. And we know that the genomes of HIV-1 and HIV-2 are not completely identical, but in their genetic makeup fairly similar. We know that HIV-2 is causing a disease which is less progressive, which is less fatal than HIV-1, and is really present in West Africa. It started in around 1940, when the species jump in probably in Guinea-Bissau happened between the sooty mangabees and humans. Then during the civil war in Guinea-Bissau, it probably propagated itself much more dramatically in the 1963-1974 period, and is now, well, you can find it worldwide, but the focus of infection still is in West Africa. Then comes 1987 with Black Monday on the 19th of October, with losses on the stock markets of about 23%. This was the beginning of The Simpsons. This was the year that the world population reached 5 billion. We're now over 7 billion, and this was the year when Prozac was introduced. This was also the year when a lot of campaigning was done, and often by famous people, and here you see Princess Diana, to really show the world that touching people with HIV is not a problem. And the fact that this was on the cover of Life magazine sort of shows you that this was important to do. This was important to show. This seems now, more than 20 years later, quite self-evident, but at that time, I can assure you it wasn't. And these small gestures by famous people were extremely necessary. This was also the year that President Reagan and Jacques Chirac, who just had taken office, met each other in the U.S. to talk about the Montagnier-Gallo dispute. And in fact, they announced that, well, both researchers would share the credit for the discovery of the AIDS virus, and more importantly, and that's really why they met, that the two countries, France and the U.S., would share the patent rights, the considerable patent rights for the blood testing. This was also the year that Western blots were becoming more and more used in laboratories for confirmation testing for HIV. So at that point in time, you first had a serological assay, one or two serological assays that would be positive, and then another assay, a Western blot assay, would be performed to really nail the diagnosis. A little bit later, this was with recombinant line immunoassays, which were a lot easier to interpret. And here you see the Inolia from Inogenetics, Belgian company, that is doing that quite nicely. This was also the year when the first antiviral was launched. This was zidovudine, Retrovir AZT, was the first antiretroviral, one of the first antiviral medications that came on the market, and the first one for HIV. The patent was filed in 1985, and a little bit later it was approved, and it could prolong the life of HIV patients. However, it wasn't really all that successful. When you look at the therapy success of monotherapy with this one medication, you could see that you get a 0.7 log drop in the viral load. But then after using this for a couple of months, resistance would develop, and actually the viral load would go up again to actually the original level. So there was only a very moderate prolongation of the life of the HIV patients. Then we come to 1988. That was the year that crack cocaine entered the streets of the U.S. and Europe. That was the year that George Bush wins the election against Michael Dukakis. The year that Salman Rushdie wrote the Satanic Verses, and this was also the year that on the 1st of December, it was World AIDS Day. That was the first time that this, in 1988, was celebrated. This was also the year that Abbott launched the first automated benchtop immunochemistry analyzer, the IMX. I remember it rather fondly because it automated a lot of the processes, and that was the machine that we ran the first automated HIV assays on, also in my lab. This was also the year that DNA detection, or I should say RNA detection of HIV became possible by using PCR and quantitative PCR methods. It was, and that was really quite dramatic because the sensitivity of an HIV detection went up dramatically by at least 6 orders of magnitude, and it had direct clinical implications. So, I mean, now we wouldn't dream of doing this anymore, and everything is automated and a lot easier. But at that time, seeing these bands on electrophoresis was quite something, because the sensitivity was at that time absolutely unheard of. 1990 was the year that the Hubble Space Telescope was launched, that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and that was the start of the first Gulf War with Operation Desert Shield. It was the year when Nelson Mandela was freed from this Robben Island prison, and it was also the year that the ozone layer became popular. This was also the year that Keith Haring died. Keith Haring, the famous American artist and also social activist. He only reached 31 years of age, and he was really one of the first AIDS campaigners, making many of the long-lasting visuals for the AIDS campaigns. 1990 was also the year when we realized exactly how important viral load measurements became. So at that point in time, viral load measurements, however crude, were becoming possible, and immediately it was realized that in blue you see the drop in CD4 lymphocyte counts. In red you see the initial extremely high viral load, and then a gradual increase of the viral load, ultimately leading to death. This was also the year that we realized that if we really want to prolong the life of HIV patients, we have to decrease the viral load. The lower the viral load, the slower the progression of the disease, and that realization led to an increase in the efforts to make very good antivirals. This was also the year when the Abbott Global HIV Surveillance Program was first successful, really looking at HIV strains from across the planet to ensure that the assays that were on the market, or the assays that were developed, would pick up all the different HIV assays, the different HIV strains. And in 1990, a very important one, Group O, was in this way discovered. 1991 was the end of the Soviet Union. It was also the end of Freddie Mercury, the lead singer from Queen, who died from AIDS at 45 years of age. This was the year when the airbag was first installed in cars, and it was also the year of the major cholera outbreak in South America. This was also the year when the red ribbon for HIV was launched. Actually, it was first worn by Jeremy Irons here with Julie Andrews at the Tony Awards in June 1991, and since then that symbol has become quite iconic. This was also the year in November 1991 when the LA Lakers basketball star Irvin, or Magic Johnson, pronounced to the world that that he had HIV, that he had contracted the virus that caused AIDS. At that point in time, it was still perceived as being a death sentence. And this was almost the same as proclaiming his own death sentence, but it generated a lot of attention for the HIV cause. If a good guy such as Magic Johnson would come out and say, hey, I have HIV, and this is something that people in my close family circle should not be concerned about in terms of transmission. That had an extreme impact. 1994 was the year of the first genetically modified tomato. It had the premiere of Ranst. It was the opening of the Eurotunnel under the canal in between France and Great Britain. It was also the year of the genocide in Rwanda, where 800,000 Tutsis were killed by the Hutus. This was also the year when AIDS was the major killer of American men between 25 and 44. And here you can see all the different reasons why people die, and the only curve that crosses all these lines since 1981 is AIDS, and it reached its pinnacle, in fact, in terms of mortality in 1994, 1995, and then soon after started declining. This was also the year when a lot of other antiviral medications, DDI, DDC, D4T, were coming on the market, and then people could start using double nucleoside combinations, and that had a bigger success than monotherapy. I mean, the viral load went down 1.5 logs, and although resistance would still develop, the viral load would creep up again, but for the first time it would not reach the original level anymore, and there would be a sort of a net gain after therapy. So there, from that time on, there was really a vested interest to get as many people as possible on antiviral drugs. Then we come in 1995 with the Kikwit epidemic of Ebola, the year of the O.J. Simpson trial, the acquittal of O.J. Simpson. This was the year when the Schengen Accord allowed the free movement of goods and people in the first 7 countries in Europe. And this was also the beginning of the World Wide Web, with and we all remember that, the first browsers, Alta Vista and Yahoo, allowed the World Wide Net. This was also the year when the Abbott AxSYM, one of my favorite machines, was launched, where 1 year later the first HIV 1 and 2 ELISA was launched on this automated platform. This was also the year when Peter Piot became the president of UNAIDS, a position he held from 1995 to 2008, really putting a major effort in curtailing the HIV epidemic. Then we come to 1996, the year of Dolly, the first cloning of a sheep from an adult cell, the start of eBay, the start of the Spice Girls, and The English Patient was the major movie there. That was the year when we realized that the entry process for HIV was not as easy as originally thought. It was not a simple process. This was the year that we discovered that there were co-receptors such as CCR5 that were needed in order for HIV to enter the T4 helper cell. When the CCR5, especially the mutation, the deletion of 32 nucleotides in CCR5 was discovered, this was also the year that we understood why some people, and this is Feliciana, who is a prostitute in in Nairobi, in Kenya, why some of these women, even though they probably encountered HIV daily, were not infectable. I mean, they survived for many, many years because they had a homozygous defect in the CCR5 HIV-1 co-receptor. This is present in about heterozygously in about 20% of the European population. It's quite rare in Africa, and maybe part of the reason why the epidemic was able to spread much more there. But that was also realized then. So when you have a mutation in CCR5, a deletion of 32 nucleotides, 32 is not divisible by 3, which means that you create a frame shift, and the CCR5 delta 32 gene product would not be able to function as a co-receptor for HIV. So if you are homozygous for that mutation, that means that you are de facto uninfectable, well, using in normal terms, with HIV. 1997 was the start of the H5N1 bird flu in Hong Kong. It was the start of Google. It was the year that Princess Diana died in a car accident in the end of August. And 5 days later, Mother Teresa died in Calcutta. This was also the year when the advertisements for anti-AIDS campaigns became more and more graphic. I mean, here, Mother Teresa had AIDS. Of course, that was not true. But now I have your attention, stop AIDS. And people were using ever more graphical pictures and representations to illustrate their AIDS campaigns, really leading to a situation where people got sick and tired of these campaigns. And this was the year when many of the campaigns sort of went down in intensity, often being accompanied by an increase in HIV even in developed countries. Here you can see this baby has the chin of grandfather, the eyes of the father, and HIV from the mother, and they're much more graphical representations or much more graphical advertisements that I cannot show you here. 1998 was the year that Pfizer launched Viagra, that Monica Lewinsky had her affair with Bill Clinton. It was the year of Titanic. It was also the year that Osama bin Laden attacked the American embassies in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam. This was also the year that the Terman assay, the point-of-care assay, or the assay that you could do at home, was launched with, in fact, for these rapid assays, a very decent sensitivity and specificity. But that was launched in 1998. This was also the year when the genotyping, looking for genotypic resistance to HIV, became ever more popular, so that people who were on antiviral therapy would be tested regularly, genotypically, to look for drug resistance mutations in the HIV population in their blood. If resistance was creeping up, then some of the drugs in the cocktail which these patients received would be changed so that they become susceptible again. 1998 was the year when highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HAART, was introduced using a triple combination of 3 different drugs, and this was extremely important. That was the year when the protease inhibitors were becoming popular, and that really decreased the viral load with between 2 and 3 log, so much deeper than with the monotherapy or double nucleoside combinations. And more importantly, if you would keep taking these drugs, then there would be no resistance developing, and that changed really everything for the HIV patients, because, well, life went on. You have to imagine that many of the people who received an AIDS or an HIV diagnosis, it was sort of a death sentence, and they took out their life insurance, made a trip around the world, and then came home to die. And suddenly you have these medications that basically will be able to guarantee these people a normal lifespan. So that changed everything dramatically for the good, because life goes on with these HAART therapy. However, it's not all that great, because well, at that point in time, taking HIV drugs meant literally a handful of pills that had to be taken during a day, including antibiotics, including multiple doses of different 3 antiviral drugs at the same time. People had to set their alarm clock every 6 hours to wake up at night or early in the morning to take their next dose. And so therapy, well, following exactly the therapy was very difficult for many of them. But they knew full well that if they would take a drug holiday, then then the effect of the therapy would be eliminated, and the therapy still had a lot of side effects at that time. So, although since then HIV is not at least in Western countries where people can afford these often expensive medications at that point in time, it was not a deadly disease anymore. It became a chronic disease. It was not a fiesta. You still had to take a lot of medications. This has changed now too. The only thing you have to take now is 1 pill a day. Tenofovir, together with 2 other antiviral medications, in this case here in Atripla, guarantee you that if you take one of these pills, that then that's all you have to take in terms of antiviral medication. Eric de Klerk from our institute was really the father of tenofovir, and he received the Paul Janssen Award for Biomedical Research together with Anthony Fauci. And many of the, if not most of the HIV patients around the world receive these drugs that contain tenofovir. 2004 was the year of the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, killing more than 200,000 people. The beginning of Facebook. It was also the discovery or the uncovering of the systematic torture in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. And Armstrong wins his 6th consecutive Tour de France, but had to hand them in again in 2012 because he cheated. This was the year when good news for HIV started to come out. This graph illustrates the successful antiretroviral therapy scale-up in Malawi, one of the hardest hit countries in terms of HIV and AIDS in Africa. But starting then, when that program started, the AIDS deaths started going down. So it was possible, even in less privileged circumstances, to combat HIV successfully with antiretroviral drugs, reducing mortality, reducing morbidity, and very importantly, reducing also transmission of the disease. That was also the year when the even more automated platform, the Abbott Architect, different models were launched, full automatic machines where you can do a lot of serological testing, including the HIV assays. And that was the year when the first HIV antigen antibody combo, so the 4th generation Architect HIV assay was launched with a superior sensitivity compared to the earlier assays. And then we immediately go to 2014, the year of the Gaza war, where more than 2,000 Palestinians, including 500 children, were killed. The year of Ebola in West Africa, with more than 11,000 people getting killed. The year that Germany wins the World Cup soccer in Brazil, and the first time that a spaceship, or the space probe Philae, on the Rosetta project, lands on Comet 67P. This was the year, last year, that UNAIDS launched a very ambitious project in order to try to get 90% of all people living with HIV knowing their HIV status, that 90% of all people living with HIV will receive and continue to receive antiretroviral therapy. And this would be the year 2020 that 90% of all people receiving antiretroviral therapy will have a durable viral suppression. So that was the lofty goal of WHO and UNAIDS for 2020. We're not there yet. This is where we are in 2014, 2015. About 37 million people are living with HIV, but only 20 million are diagnosed. So 53% are diagnosed. A small half of them are not diagnosed yet. About 41% are on antiretroviral therapy, and this is already much more than a couple of years before that. And from these 15 million, close to, or 11.6 million people have viral suppression with extremely low viral loads. And then comes 2015, and you know that this was not the best year. This was the year of Je suis Charlie, of the attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris, followed by the November terrorist attacks in Paris. This was the year of the Volkswagen emission scandal, the European migrant crisis, but there was also good news. NASA announced the presence of flowing liquid water on Mars. And UNAIDS this year proclaimed an even loftier goal. Now the goal is not only to achieve these 90-90-90 goals by 2020, but this was the first year that it was really formulated that the AIDS epidemic should be ended by 2030. Mathematical projections show that if everybody does his utmost, that it is really possible to end the AIDS epidemic by 2030. So that would mean that in a span of about 50 years, a disease which caused a major epidemic or pandemic would be completely ended. We're only 2015, so we're still 15 years away. So that allows us still to be optimistic in reaching that goal. I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for that highly informative presentation, Professor Van Ranst. We want to get right away to your questions and input, so here's a reminder how to let us know what you have to say. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A button at the lower left. We will try to get to all of you, but if not, we will be sure to follow up after the broadcast. We have lots of great questions coming in, and our first question is from Julia, who asks, what is the most significant steps for AIDS research?
And I assume that Julia means which are the next big steps that need to be reached. I think the UNAIDS goals of 1990 and the end of the epidemic by 2030 are the most important steps. That I know that's not AIDS research. That's AIDS policy or HIV policy. But we have all the necessary tools to combat this epidemic. The only thing which we cannot do yet is cure people completely. And this might be the ultimate goal, the holy grail in retrovirology or in HIV or AIDS research is, can we get a complete cure? Can we eliminate the virus from the body? And that's still, I think, far away.
Okay, thank you. Next, Georgios T. from Oxford University Hospital NIH Trust asks, have there been any recent evidence to support the hypothesis that cross-regulation of co-stimulatory molecules, CD80 and CD86 and CTLA4 can form the basis of new T-cell mediated therapies for HIV?
Let's put that as one of the lofty goals in HIV research. If that would be possible, that would mean that you're very close to that would mean that you're very close to a cure. I know that many people work on this. However, for a disease which, at its worst, caused 5% mortality, or 5% of the people on this planet died of HIV and AIDS, the resources devoted to these therapies are actually not that great. If you would put all the HIV researchers that work on HIV cure and on HIV vaccines in an auditorium, you actually would not fill a complete auditorium with the principal investigators. So for a disease which kills 5% of the human population, the resources that are given to this kind of research are not that great.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Heather Jackson from Rogers State University, who says, I see that there is also a note of CMV infection. Were these patients actively ill with cytomegalovirus as well as KSV or P. carinii? Does CMV play a role in the disease progression or discovery, or was it just chance?
Well, CMV infections are always present or always on our mind in people who are immunosuppressed for whatever reason. And virologists know that very well because a lot of their time is devoted to transplant patients with CMV problems. So CMV is one of these opportunistic infections that are going to profit from an immune system not functioning optimal, and it does the same in HIV. So HIV, for example, CMV, for example, retinitis was one of the, before cidofovir was discovered, was one of the major opportunistic infections in HIV patients causing blindness. We don't see that anymore because we know how to combat it, especially the CMV retinitis. So CMV is always a nasty virus that we look out for in immunocompromised patients of every kind, be it HIV or be it transplant patients.
Great. Next, we have Yusuf S. from the International Project for Laboratory, who asks, is there any strong relationship between tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS? And then he also asks, what is the different impact to HIV from MDR-TB and XDR-TB?
Oh. When you look at the map of countries suffering greatly from HIV, and you look at the map of countries suffering greatly from tuberculosis, you will see that there is a lot of overlapping. So TB is definitely one of these diseases that again profit from people having HIV to create a lot more havoc than it does alone. Although tuberculosis does perfectly fine without HIV in terms of killing people. Together with HIV and malaria, it belongs to the three organisms that are the major killers. If you look at who kills people or what kills people on this planet, you have HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. So one bacteria, one parasite, and one virus. These three organisms kill close to 10% of the population. So yes, they will work synergetically in order to make people sick, but they can do quite nasty things on their own too.
Great. Next we have Patrick S. from Florida Hospital Winter Park, who asks, many infected individuals on medications have an undetectable viral load. If the medications prevent replication and the viral load is undetectable, why doesn't the immune system eradicate the virus?
That's a very important question. And this is a question which HIV patients themselves very often ask. We're luckily now, we're in a situation where many of the HIV patients come to the lab and they receive, or to their physician, and they receive the results undetectable. 6 months later, undetectable. 6 months later, undetectable. But undetectable does not mean that the virus is not there. And they often think so. And all of them, at a certain point in time, are willing to sort of try to stop the medication to see if they're not secretly cured. However, every time that they do this, the viral load goes up again. And if they wait long enough with their medication, the viral load goes up again till the point where they started. And in fact, the progression will start again towards AIDS. So there is no cure yet. The reason why the immune system cannot completely combat it is because there are HIV reservoirs in places in the body where the immune system cannot really reach it too readily. So there are some hidden reservoirs or semi-hidden reservoirs where the immune system cannot really do its complete task of eradicating this virus. We know that a couple of viral particles or that our immune system is perfectly capable to handle a couple of viral particles and eradicate it completely. But we're not reaching that because of these reservoirs.
Okay. Catherine S. would like to know if you could comment on the prevalence and incidence in Africa versus US and Europe.
Of course, the difference is dramatically. In African countries, although that situation has improved, and has improved by a large margin over the last couple of years, HIV is still, I would say, problem number one, really problem number one. In Africa, wherever you go, sub-Sahara Africa, HIV is a disease which affects all people. Either you are infected by HIV or you are affected by HIV. People die from HIV, or people take care of the children of parents who died from HIV. So HIV is something which is, for many people, regretfully, a daily reality. So this is something which we cannot even start to imagine in Europe and the US. In the US, at its peak, about 1% of the population was HIV infected. In a country such as Belgium, it's closer to 0.1%. So if you want to make it really simple, 0.1% in an average European country, 1% in the US, and 10% in an average, and I don't know that exists, African country. So the scale by which HIV is a problem is definitely different around the world, with the big problem being that the less privileged countries are the worst affected.
We have another question from Heather J. from Rogers State University, who asks if the one pill, does it combine all three medications listed, or are three medications still required as separate medications?
No. Big progress has been made over the past years to really make a single pill that has to be taken daily. I know many of these people still take other medications to combat or to prevent opportunistic infections, but their antiretroviral drugs that really and literally used to be a handful of pills every day has now gone down to one pill a day. And that sort of generated a false sense of security, where a once deadly disease became a chronic disease which could be solved with one pill. And that in some countries and some parts of the population that generated a false sense of security, as if HIV was not as important as it was in the past.
Great. Next, Alexander M. from Gorgas Memorial Institute. Gorgas Memorial Institute for Health Study asks, what are the chances to have an effective vaccine in the next years?
Many people are asking the same question, and I see this question coming up in the lists of questions a couple of times. In the beginning, people said, oh, in 5 to 10 years we'll have a vaccine. I'm an optimistic person, and I would still say the same. However, we've seen a lot of, failures of the HIV vaccines that were in clinical trials. The problem is that, A, it's not simple. You're actually shooting at a moving target. You're actually shooting at a moving target that is moving incredibly fast. HIV is one of the most rapidly mutating RNA viruses. So it's definitely not easy to make a vaccine against these kinds of viruses. But the economic reality is also so that many of the pharmaceutical companies are currently making these antiretrovirals. We know that antiretrovirals, or with antiretrovirals, you can eradicate HIV, which means, and personally I don't think that that's the right course, but then hey, I'm not one of these companies' leaders, that the resources devoted to finding novel HIV vaccines probably is not at a level where it should be. And I think people are becoming more and more complacent by thinking that with antiretroviral drugs, we'll be able to eradicate HIV. In theory, it is possible. It is even perfectly possible, because HIV is not all that easily transmitted. You need sex. In most cases, you need sex to transmit the infection, and God knows that's not all that easy. So you could not avoid getting the flu, but you can avoid getting HIV. So combined with treating the already existing patients, in theory and in mathematical models, it is possible to eradicate HIV using antiretrovirals alone. However, a vaccine would have been a much preferred solution, but hey, we don't have it, and well, it's hard to predict the future because the future didn't happen yet. That's actually Yogi Berra, the New York Yankees catcher, who once said that. So it's, well, we don't know. I mean, we can keep hoping for an HIV vaccine, but as the years are progressing, and as we might near 2030, and as it goes in the right direction with HIV eradication, maybe we won't get it, and maybe we don't need it.
I like your optimism. Next we have Duping Zhang from the CDC, who asks, can you comment on HIV vaccine R&D and what role of CD4 and viral load should be in treatment monitoring?
Well, I think we already covered some of the HIV vaccine R&D, although I think that much larger resources should be devoted to it. Viral load monitoring is the mainstay treatment monitoring that we have right now. In the beginning, we were quite reluctant to use viral load monitoring very often because it is quite expensive compared to CD4 monitoring. When the years are progressing, I think most of the physicians really rely on viral load treatment monitoring quite regularly. And frankly, at every visit that the HIV patients bring to the hospital, most of the time a viral load measurement will be taken. Luckily, in many times it will be undetectable, and if it's not, then a change in therapy can be done. So viral load monitoring and genotypic resistance monitoring are at this moment the most important, maybe replacing CD4 monitoring, although if I look at my lab, very often when they ask a viral load, I see that the CD4 is still asked for.
Okay, next we have Arden from Johns Hopkins University, who asks if you could comment on the rising prevalence of AIDS in Asia.
Asia was one of the was the last continent where HIV would rise. So at a certain point in time, people thought, okay, maybe Asia will escape the AIDS epidemic. However, that's not the case. Asia and the Pacific region is now confronted with a devastating HIV/AIDS epidemic. But instead of the 1980s, it only started in the even late 1990s to be really established around the region. We can also see that, and that's the same in Africa as in Asia, that although the epidemic started later there, we also see the same decline in deaths, and that can be written on the account of antiretroviral therapy in Asia too. So about 25% decline or 30% decline in Africa, close to 30-35% decline in deaths in Asia since successful AIDS therapy was launched.
Okay, next we have Klaus from BioSpider Technologies, who asks, under optimal anti-HIV therapy, how many patients, if any, can achieve non-detectable HIV virus status?
I think most can reach non-detectable HIV virus status if a patient is compliant. So, which means if the patient takes his or her medication on time, the way it should be taken, then many, if not most, will reach HIV non-detectable virus status. So if that's not the case, then very often the HIV therapy is not optimal, and then you have to look at HIV resistance developing, or change the HIV treatment regimen to achieve non-detectable HIV status. It's actually when we do viral loads now in patients that are on therapy for a long time, most of the results are undetectable or close to undetectable.
Okay. We have lots of great questions coming in, but unfortunately we have only time for one more question. So the final question is from Bakir R. from Mayo Clinic, who asks, sorry, I lost my spot for 1 minute. Who asks if is the same treatment, medical treatment for HIV-1 and HIV-2 effective for both?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, most of the research has been done on, and I think rightfully so, because that was the biggest problem, on HIV-1. And we know that HIV-2, the need for treatment is less than in HIV-1, so many people, and especially in the beginning years when the treatment modalities had a lot of side effects, would choose not to receive therapy, and since the disease was slowly progressing, it would work. Some of the antiretrovirals work in HIV too, but this is definitely understudied, and remarkably understudied, in fact.
Well, I would like once again to thank Professor Van Ranst for his presentation. Do you have any final comments for us?
No, I would like to thank everybody for attending and spending some time on the history of HIV. And it's a story. It's a sad story, of course, but it's also a story where we can get a lot of hope. If we, as humanity, can be confronted with a disease and solve it in a matter of a couple of decades, I think that's no small feat. That is something to be optimistic about.
Well, once again, thank you for your presentation. If we weren't able to speak directly with you today, we'll be sure to follow up with you. Thank you for taking part. We want to thank today's presenter as well for joining us here at LabRoots, the leading scientific social networking site. For more information, please visit us at labroots.com. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing and on our website through May 2016. We will let you know when it's been posted, and we hope you pass that information on to any colleagues who couldn't take part in today's webcast. See you next time, and goodbye.